Welcome, Professor Schoukens, to our series CESI Insight. This is some interview series, and we have different guests. We have different member organizations participating today. Happy to have you with us, Professor Schoukens. Professor Schoukens is a professor of social security law, head of the Department of Social Law and the Faculty of Law at the University, KU University in Leuven. Professor Schoukens, what do you think are the particular challenges and impacts on A, the labor markets, B, the employment conditions, and of course, C, the question of social protection due to the coronavirus?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation. Indeed, we are facing quite some challenging times, and well, the positive thing is that we are also part of those times, so that we are also going through those difficult periods, and that we can also in a direct way feel what's going on. Now, as to the challenges, I would like to make a distinction between short-term and long-term. I will mainly focus upon social protection. To some extent, I also will relate to labor market. I think the short-term, it's quite clear and evident. There is an enormous fear of, on the one hand, unemployment, so that people will get unemployed short-term, but also long-term unemployed. That people will lose their jobs because of the economic challenges we are facing, and the fact that less labor will be available. And secondly, also in the short term, there is, I think, a major concern as to social protection, as to the cost, the budget from two sides. We are facing well, quite some challenges as to the modernization of our social protection. When I refer to old age, we have the issue of aging, which is quite costly. When I refer to healthcare, we have the issue of an increasing cost of the healthcare because of the very complicated techniques which are being applied. And now, in addition, we have this. And then thirdly, we have related to what I mentioned before, we have the issue of unemployment. So that's also a major cost which will come up. We are now, I think, especially in Europe, using quite often temporary unemployment to soften a bit the impact and to make sure that people will not be immediately fired. That's a good thing. I also noticed that in the non-traditional work, the non-standard work, like self-employment, like platform work, there as well, states suddenly start to apply temporary unemployment schemes upon those groups, which is quite revolutionary. And that's, I think, a good thing. I will come back to that later. But that will, of course, at a certain moment, that will create a budget, a cost. So for the time being, we are willing to spend this because we see that it has an advantage, but it will come back to Social Security at a certain moment later on. This will have a financial impact. On the long term, the challenge, and that's connected to the good thing as well. Let me take again that example of the non-standard work, the self-employment and platform work. Now suddenly we start to apply schemes like unemployment upon those groups. This was in some countries unthinkable, and up till some years ago, to apply an unemployment benefit to a group of, let's say, the self-employed people. To take one example, the Netherlands, but to some extent also Germany, this was a kind of unthinkable issue, that the risk of unemployment should be protected for self-employed. They take risks, so it's upon them. What do I notice here? That the corona crisis start to develop, and that suddenly those countries, like in the Netherlands, immediately start to apply some kind of temporary unemployment upon those groups. So apparently what was completely impossible some months ago turns out to become possible rather quickly because of this crisis, which is a good thing, I think. But it's immediately also dangerous because now what we have been doing is, in a very easy, almost unconditional way, not too difficult for the application, start to give flat rate benefits, for instance, not only for workers, but also for self-employed. And I think in the longer term, we have to rethink those unemployment schemes for those groups. The danger is, and I want to specify that, imagine that within 3 years, we have another big issue coming up, a big problem, a big crisis, a big flooding, for instance, I don't know, and that quite some people cannot work or cannot run their businesses anymore, population will take it for granted and will expect to have again those benefits in the same ways and so on. And there I think those techniques will have to be refined. I think it has to be made more conditional. We have to check, for instance, in Corona now, we will have definitely some losers, but also some winners. And we also have to pay attention that by now granting benefits to people who may turn out to be winners, in some way they also have to contribute now or later. And those things are not present now. We simply give benefits. But we should not forget that in a later stage, we have to fine-tune those schemes. So the good thing is, I think we opened up some schemes to those new groups, but the challenge will be for the future to fine-tune those schemes to their specific working situations, and we may have to ask some more contributions from some people, from the winners, if I can say so, and that will be very hard. We should not forget about this. When this crisis is under control or over, then the real work in social protection and labor market should start to redefine, to fine-tune those schemes. If we forget about it, the next crisis, people will take it for granted. And that's not good for social protection because it's a kind of thing of rights and obligations. So that's a challenge for the longer term, I see.
We have been also from CESI side in the past increasingly analyzing the new challenges which are coming through digitalization of work. And now, of course, we see in some kind of extremely fast developments which are happening in this regard. And we have identified increasingly the need of a seamless social protection, social security coverage. And so what you're saying is, of course, something is moving into that direction, and social protection mechanisms are basically applied increasingly regardless of the status. And do you also think this will, when we speak about benefits or chances of this crisis, also be some kind of catalyst for indeed moving on? As you said, also this will be discussion for the future in terms of having, say, seamless social protection schemes linked to the individual and less linked to the actual status of workers.
Yes, and I would like to refine it a little bit more to the individual, but I would even like to say more to income and income raising. I think social protection, although we know already for decades schemes which are applicable to self-employed or to non-traditional workers, still we see that very often social protection is designed around traditional work still now. And I think this crisis will push it again a bit further. So I see two positive things. The one I already mentioned is it pushed again further towards non-standard work, the idea of having them fully socially protected, even in very extreme situations like unemployment for the self-employed. The second positive thing, and that's something I did not mention before, is that the idea of collectivity becomes very tangible. Some years ago, I remember we had some major interviews with CEOs of social security administrations, and one of the major challenges they saw in 2010, in 10 years' time, so it's now, 2020, 2025, they said, one of the major challenges is not so much aging or whatever, it's more to have the population again understand what is social protection and social security about. It's about rights and obligations, but it's also about the idea of the collectivity. And that idea of the collectivity is something very hard to explain. What is it concretely? Of course, you can say one day you will face the risk and then you will be happy that you're in social protection, but then people will not understand. Sometimes they say, yeah, okay, but it's abstract collectivity. When you think about your individual protection, it's more concrete, but collectivity is very abstract. Corona crisis confronted us with the need to act in a way responsible, not only towards yourself, towards your family, but also towards the collectivity. We are changing our way simply to protect the collectivity. And that's something I think it became very concrete. It's a very interesting, positive thing about this crisis. And in that way, it can also help to understand again what collectivity is, because everybody is now talking about responsibility. Solidarity is now becoming very fashionable, but also collectivity, and that Corona crisis is even a concrete example. But collectivity means then also duties, not only rights. Now we have very much rights, but also duties. And I hope that in the near future, and those new working groups and so on, that societies and systems will take the responsibility also to have a look back and to see we have been helping some people, but were they really in need? And I mean, that's something which will come true, or which will become clear later on. So maybe now we are giving benefits to some people or to some employers or to some industries, but later on it may be that actually they did not suffer. They even have been winning. Yesterday I heard that some textile industries and some textile shops, they say now we make a major turnover because we are now selling a lot of textile and so on for all those mouth masks and so on, mouth masks. That's amazing. Maybe they had a fear and they were losing some weeks ago, but overall in the year maybe they will be a winner. And I think at the end of the crisis, when the crisis is stable, we should also have that idea. Well, let us have now a look back, and maybe we have been supporting some industries or supporting some individuals or supporting some workers or supporting some self-employed, but maybe unnecessary. And maybe we have to ask them through contributions or taxes a kind of return to create solidarity again between those who have been winning and those who have been losing. So I think it's opening up the application of the schemes to some groups we would never have been thinking about, but we should not forget that we have to rethink and reconsider our system when the crisis starts to stabilize. I think that's one of the major messages which I would like to get through. Social security, again, it's about rights and obligations. It's the logic of social insurance is very much in that, and we should not forget about it. Now I see a tendency that many states give flat rate benefits instantly, and I think indeed there's a need of urgency. We have to, and in need of emergency, we have to act. But by doing that, we should not forget that especially social insurances are also reflecting some of the insurance principles. And if we don't pay attention, we are slipping away to a kind of flat rate universal scheme for everybody a little bit. But social security is more than providing a little bit. It's about living standards we have to protect.
If we have a look now also at the impacts on our ways to work now and on working conditions, once again the crisis is some kind of catalyst of a process which has of course started already a couple of years ago, but now as we are now together today, we have a video conference and everybody's home working and what do you think? Of course, this has tremendous impacts on also the question, what is work, or maybe even what is work? What is working time? I mean, the relation, I mean, to define, am I working right now? Am I just working in between? Or just taking care of the kids? All these questions will arise. Do you think that we will need also in terms of how could I say, of labor law, new practical approaches and also legal definitions maybe of what is working time, what is a workplace, and will that not also lead to new responsibilities, so both for the worker and for the employer, given the case that we speak of employers here?
I do think that that's something we are all facing all together. I think that a minority of people continue to work in a traditional way, going to the working premises. But I think a majority started to work from home in a more flexible way, and so on and so forth. So what was traditionally considered to be standard work, you worked on the premises of the employer, that was already changing. Already some decades this was under pressure. I think this may have become a minor element in the traditional standard work relation. The same with working time. This was also already under pressure. Does that mean that we have to completely give up, abandon the whole logic of protection of working time? I would like to answer that in two levels. No, because we have to be careful that some people may then, well, especially fragile workers, may at the end of the day be the victim of loosening this kind of protection, but we have to reinvent new types of measuring working time. I'm not a labor law specialist myself, but I think there are ways of rethinking this. not in the traditional ways we are used to. And that's, I think, a challenge, especially for labor market specialists and labor law specialists. Yes, I think there I see a major challenge of how to rethink labor law and labor working time. Secondly, when I look a bit more into social protection, I think the emphasis will be maybe less upon work. Where do you work? Already in a European concept, this was already a challenge. I mean, if you see how mobile we were, and still we were focusing so much in national social security law and European social security law to the place of work, we really have to ask ourselves, is that place of work where you physically are working, is that the most relevant? I hear now that European international institutions are struggling a little bit what to do with those conventions on coordination and with the European coordination regulation, because the place where you work is indicating the competent state. But now we have massively people, frontier workers who work normally in the Netherlands, but now are bound to work in Belgium from home. Where are they working then? Do we have to massively shift now the social protection from the Netherlands to Belgium? Because in the majority of my time, I'm now physically working in Belgium for a Dutch employer. The same, so that I think we have to think about. The same for work and working time. And maybe the focus has to become in social security more and more upon income. People earn an income, and that income we would like to protect in social security in case you're victim of a risk. Whether that income is earned per hour, that's a logic of the past, I think. For many, more and more, especially with those non-standard workers, this is increasing, but that's what we are facing now as well. I think the emphasis should be more upon what do people earn as an income and how to protect that income in case they cannot earn that income anymore. And this gives immediately some perspectives. The perspective being that income, we have been focusing that far too much upon work. But I think in reality, the ways of earning income are more wide than work. They're wider than, let's say, 30, 40 years ago, or more important. People earn income in all kinds of ways. It can be return of capital, it can be return of renting houses, it can be a subsidy if you're an influencer, a very fashionable influencer, you get a subsidy. Is that income out of work? And I think this was something already emerging and growing, and especially with the self-employed, we were already challenging that, because self-employed to some extent have an income out of professional work, but next to that they also have an income out of their investments and capital, and what to deal with the return of the investment and the capital for social protection. So those things were already there, but this will intensify. This will be intensified, I think, by this crisis, even more than before. And yeah, I mean, that's something we really have to pay attention. I'm now working 25 years in this field, and already in the beginning of the 1990s, they were saying we have to find new ways of financing social security, not only about the income out of work. Well, indeed, we have to take more and more into consideration other income people are earning to have it protected. This is quite challenging because it's not so easy. We're very much used to the thinking in work perspective. How far to go with that? It's not easy, but I think this is something which is now really coming on the edge
Professor Schoukens, now you're basically saying, of course, that the new ways of work, there's some in new ways of work, in new forms of work, there's an increased decoupling, let's say, from the place of work, from the concept of working time, from the state, from you're working in. So my question is, do you think that trade unions are still needed? What is the key role? Because we have been saying also from CESI side in the past that we need the increasing need for trade unions consists in the fact that these workers have to be, let's call it, recoupled either to a social security scheme or to a, let's say, a legal order of a certain member state, and of course also to make sure that whatever occupational safety and health provisions would be applicable, among them working time, as somehow through these it can be ensured that, as you said, especially fragile workers can be protected. How do you see now, given these tremendous changes in the world of work, the role of trade unions?
I think they have an important role to play. And as work is changing and the concept of work is changing, I think they also have to reflect to what extent they have to change to take into account these evolutions. And I would like to start with a concrete example. I think what is going on in the Netherlands now is very fascinating with the self-employed, especially the solo self-employed and the freelancers and platform work. Some may argue that self-employed people and solo self-employed and you non-standard workers, let's put it like that, they don't need to be represented and protected like the workers were represented by the trade unions. I don't believe that. When you see how it's moving, bottom up, you see that those people organize themselves. They also have spokesmen, very often spokeswomen, I noticed, who freelancers and platform workers and self-employed. And they don't always feel very much, let's say, heard by the traditional social partners. So that in a way they are frustrated. But it shows that the need for representation and the need to come up for their rights is present. I mean, bottom up, it's happening. And we have all kinds of organizations, one is bigger than the other one, popping up, asking for to be heard and so on and so forth. The second thing is a frustration. What I notice is sometimes that the social partners think that they simply have to apply what is in place for the workers upon those new groups, and then everything will be solved. So you have a question on supplementary pensions, no problem. We have a traditional way of dealing with supplementary pensions in the social partners. We will simply invite, or to say it less positively, impose these schemes upon you and everything will be solved. The same for the work accidents or the working capacity. We have some schemes in the social partners in our country. We simply apply it upon you and everybody will be happy. And then you see the frustration. You see those people say, but that's not functioning because we are not wage earners. The working capacity, the risk of working capacity for a freelancer is differently perceived. It can be loss of income and it can also be loss of work. And we need a more tailored approach for this risk. We don't need that scheme which is designed for the traditional wage earner. And then you see misunderstanding from both sides. They start to shout at each other. They start to quarrel and so on and so forth. They start even to threaten each other. But it's simply because they don't pay enough attention that those new workers, if I can say so, or non-standard workers, they may have different needs. And I think one of the challenges for the trade unions or the social partners in general is to take a little bit of time and effort to understand that those, let's say, emerging non-standard workers, they're still working, they still have the main ambition to raise income, of course, but they work differently. And you have to have an open mind and to go a little bit in the mindset to find out what's going on and to understand and to analyze a little bit the risks of those people, so to have it fine-tuned. And then I don't know how it will move. I think in some countries those new emerging representation groups will grow strong enough and possibly will and in the end also be on the table, if I can say so, with the government, or I think some traditional groups which are already existing will reinvent themselves internally, like trade unions will reinvent themselves internally to accommodate those new emerging groups. But what I think is not a very good evolution is simply to impose existing structures upon them, because then it will run badly, I think.
Yeah, we have been also, of course, from our side, from CESI side, thinking a lot about the possibilities, and we also agree that bringing forward the argument that collective bargaining, collective agreement is a solution to everything, is especially then if you don't have a critical mass behind you. So we have also been favoring, say, stepwise approaches, saying first it's about individual interest representation. What is the need, for instance, of a platform worker? And then once a critical mass has been built, then indeed proceed to the collective interest representation. So, but of course, it needs, as you said, quite some rethinking and quite some questioning, of course, also of the classic industrial models we have been working with in the past, let's say 150 years.
But for instance, for collective bargaining, I know that's one of the issues now, how to apply that. Again, I'm not a labor law specialist, but things are moving on there as well. There is, of course, an issue with, let's say, the more traditional self-employed. They are in two positions. Sometimes they are an employer themselves, and at the same time, they're also working, so they cannot fulfill those both positions at the same time. But maybe the collective bargaining for some of those workers can have another kind of approach. For instance, you can also delegate to those groups that they have to organize themselves, partially the risk in a supplementary way, and so on and so forth. And then the government can outsource part of the mandate of organizing public protection, mandatory protection, to that group under certain conditions, if enough solidarity is present, and so on and so forth, so that you also respect the competition rules and so on. This is not the employers bargaining with the employees on a collective agreement. It is another logic. It is the government addressing the representation of a self-employed group or a freelance group and saying, for, let's say, the additional working capacity or the additional pension, we mandate you to organize part of that under those conditions. And you can use an insurer, or you can organize it yourself. These are the conditions. There should be enough solidarity in it. Then you can make it mandatory for your members, and so on and so forth. That's another way. It's not two groups. It is inviting a group to take responsibility for their members, so that a certain protection can be organized, and that you have a kind of outsourcing or delegation of powers to do so. But that, of course, yeah, if you're representing that group, it's another mindset than the traditional one we are used to.
Professor Schoukens, as a final comment or final remarks from your side in these not so joyful and happy moments. I remember when I was a couple of months ago at your university, and you told me that before the coronavirus came up, or the crisis came up, that you were, for the first time, very positive or quite positive about, let's say, social Europe. Would you have, in this regard, maybe a final message to us that we are proceeding, or Europe is proceeding indeed in a much more determined and positive way than maybe the past 20, 30 years?
Well, indeed, that was a bit a situation prior to this crisis. That positive idea came a bit from that recommendation on the access to social protection, the European Pillar of Social Rights, where I saw that the Commission and the European Union, in the larger setting, was feeling that the speech towards Europe and towards social security was getting too financial, too budgetary. They looked at social security mainly as a cost up till then. There's also an investment into people. And so therefore, with that recommendation, that was changing. Here again, there is a major challenge. Europe can find its position there. With that healthcare and corona crisis, I was a bit less positive. I have the feeling they were struggling very much to be present in this crisis, and they can be present in this crisis. It's also a bit a question, should Europe take over, or should we leave it to the national states? And now I feel that some countries say, or some people say, this shows should have competence in healthcare. It's not a question of or, it's not one or the other. I think it's end, but it's about finding a balance. I think Europe should be present, for instance, for healthcare. I think a lot of cooperation in, let's say, for those medical applications and so on. There you need cooperation. I think it's an insane idea that countries are fighting each other for medical applications. Their coordination and some European powers should be present. But to provide healthcare at a local level, from a general practitioner side, I think that's something you better leave to the local level. So Europe should be present, but there I think the European Union and the member states should learn from this crisis, and hopefully, let's take that positive thing, learn from this crisis, what kind of competences in healthcare, and especially in public healthcare, should we provide to the European Union to have that kind of situation never again. That does not mean that they have to take everything from healthcare. It's only one element of healthcare for public healthcare. If they manage to do that, I will be positive, and it shows that Europe has a voice, has a role to play in healthcare and social security. But again, the story is not so much it's either Europe or it's the national states. I'm a bit afraid that when you talk about social protection, welfare and healthcare, from the local level to the European level, there are some competences to be provided, and the idea is to find the balance in what kind of field should be provided to what kind of level, and then to do it in a coherent way, that they are also responsible from the financing and from the benefit. That's something which was very much discussed, let's say, at the turn of the millennium. It was about what kind of competences Europe should have and so on. And let's maybe end with a positive note, because I'm always a bit, I think we focus far too much upon negative elements in our daily life. Let's maybe end with that positive note. I think I was very positive when I looked at the pillar and the movement and the recommendation on social protection, the ideas which were running on protecting also non-standard workers for unemployment and social protection. I think that was a very good thing. If we learn that from this crisis, that Europe can also have a strong say in healthcare, when it's very clearly defined on what crisis situations, cooperation for medical supplies, that will be something very positive, I think. Europe is not only about the money, I think, not only about giving the money to run through the crisis, but it's also to take up some responsibility, active responsibility. I think the negative thing was states were fighting each other. Also in the US, you see that a little bit. They were fighting each other to get medical supplies. That's something which we should rule out for next time. And there, I think, if that message can come out clearly, and if the European Union can have some competence there clearly, so that cannot happen anymore in the future, I think that's a positive outcome. Let's hope that they shift towards that thinking.
Professor Schoukens, thanks a lot. We made 33 minutes or 32 instead of 10, but it was just too interesting. And take care of yourself, take care of your colleagues, and
likewise
of your family.
And hope to see you soon.
Yes, in person. Thanks a lot.
Okay,
yeah?
you're welcome.
Bye.
Bye.